Why do we need free choice? What's so good about free choice? All it means is that we could get ourselves into trouble and do terrible things. What's good about that? Sure, if we have free choice and we choose to do the good thing, then it's even better. But is it worth the risk? So we have to assume, and of course it's true according to the Torah, that the only freedom of choice we're given is what is necessary. I don't need freedom of choice when I'm choosing a pair of shoes. I wouldn't mind if God decides which shoes I buy and doesn't give me that freedom of choice. Or which city to live in, or what profession to pursue. I don't mind if he chooses it, and neither does he. He doesn't mind choosing it either. What needs to have freedom of choice is only moral decisions. To put it in very simple language, the only thing God cannot choose for me is him. In other words, whether I love him or hate him, whether I'm loyal to him or indifferent to him, that he can't choose. He can't. Because if he chooses it, then it's not love anymore. If he makes me love him, then it's not love. If he makes me choose him, then it's not a choice. The whole point is to have a relationship. So the relationship needs freedom of choice, nothing else. And that's why we have freedom of choice only in moral or godly issues. To obey him or disobey him, to love him or to hate him, to be loyal or disloyal. Relationship issues. Here we have to have freedom of choice in order for God to get what he wants. So he can't, according to his own plan, he can't make us love him. That's not a relationship. But yes, he can choose my shoes, and he can choose my city, and he can choose my profession, and he can choose my gender. Yes, and he can choose which generation he wants me in. All of that he chooses. So where do we have freedom of choice? Only when it comes to being good or not. In everything else, we have choice. You have to, you got to choose the shoes you're going to buy. But it's not a free choice. God influences that choice. Like, why do I prefer brown shoes? I don't. Just using it as an example. Why do I have the tastes that I have? Why do I prefer vanilla over chocolate? I'm choosing it, but I'm not really choosing it. My choice has been tampered with. So I have choices to make in life, but then I have free choice when it comes to relationships. So now it makes a little more sense that we're given freedom of choice, not so that we can get ourselves into trouble, and not so that my good is voluntary and therefore more good. It's essential. Without freedom of choice, there is no love, there is no devotion, there's no commitment, there's nothing in way of a relationship. So it is necessary, and that's where we have our freedom of choice.
So what is it about people that makes us so desperate to believe that we have free choice in everything? Why are we so desperate to hang on to that freedom?
I guess that's part of our free choice. We are free to think that we are free, even where we're not. Self-made man. No, it is no self-made man. Look, it's very simple. One of the sages, to make a long story short, one of the sages saw a man on the side of the road as he was passing by, and he noticed that the man was exceedingly ugly. Bad looking guy. So the sage said to him, "So ugly?" And the man said, "Oh, don't complain to me. Complain to my maker." And suddenly he wasn't so ugly. That little drama that happened there was that the ugliness that this man was suffering from came from his arrogance, extreme arrogance. Self-made, independent, all my way, did it all my way. The sage said, really, self-made man did a bad job when it comes to interior decorating. So the man said, no, I didn't do that. I would never make myself look like this. Complain to my creator. And it's the first time that he admitted to having a creator. And so the ugliness was a little alleviated. So that's the point. The point is, it doesn't take much to figure out. I don't choose most of the stuff. So, freedom of choice we have now identified as being the choices necessary in conducting a relationship. Everything else is really not free choice. We seem to be making choices, but they're not free. They're strongly influenced by nature, by nurture, a lot of influences. So I can't really say I chose it. It's almost like I agreed to choose it, but it was already chosen for me. All right, now, in this freedom of choice, I have a number of options. There are people who choose to do the most distasteful, ugly, nasty things, which some people would never choose. There's a certain cynicism or a certain indifference, a coldness that some people just don't see as an option. So as much as I have freedom of choice, I'm also limited by what there is to choose. What are the options? They're not endless. For example, Tanya tells us that the average person does not have the choice of becoming a saint, of becoming a tzaddik. Among the choices, that does not exist in the average person's repertoire. I cannot choose to be a tzaddik. It's not going to happen. And then there are people on the opposite extreme. They can't choose to be a murderer. They can't. They faint at the sight of blood. So that's not an option for them. Just a simple application of this idea Today we can choose to sin. You know, every person has their favorite sin. Once Mashiach comes, sin will not be an option. Will I then not have freedom of choice? I will have freedom of choice, but sinning will no longer be an option. It just won't be available. Because unholiness will be removed from the world. So I'm going to have to find other things to make choices over or about. But sinning will not be one of them. So there are people who, for whatever reason, find it totally distasteful and unthinkable to actually sin. They'll talk about it. They'll think about it. They'll fantasize about it. They would never do it. Never. It's just not part of their makeup. Because to actually sin, well, that's a lot of chutzpah. They wouldn't do that. Then there are people who, for whatever reason, would do the sin, but they would never dwell on it. They would never fantasize, daydream. That to them is so unnatural or distasteful that they would never allow themselves. You know, you sit around thinking about these things, you're a weirdo. Okay, you did it, it's over, it's done. But what, you've been thinking about it? That's crazy. So he would never allow himself to indulge in sinful daydreaming, because that means your head is wrong. There's something not right up on top, and that's not acceptable. You did it. You know, if nobody gets hurt, what's the harm? So some people think doing is too real. I can joke about it, I can talk about it, I can think about it. No harm done. But to do it, got to be crazy. And then there are people the opposite. Yeah, I did it. It was there. I had the opportunity. I didn't think too much. I did it. You think I sit around and dream about these things? What do you think I am? Everybody's got their pride. Then there are people who would never sit around and think of unholy, unsavory thoughts, and they would never do it. But talk? Yeah, we were just talking. He said this, so I said that. It was just talk. But what do you think I sit around and daydream about this? Never. You think I'm about to do it? No. Now, that list of options is also not our choice. Which means God gives us particular options. We don't all have the same temptations. We don't all have the same Yetzer Hara. We're not all tempted for the same sin. It would be stiff competition if we were all trying to sin with the same sin. So some people will sin in thought, some people will sin in speech, some people will sin in action. And then among actions, there are people who will sin violently, aggressively, hurtful, destructive. That's their kind of sin. And then there are the more subtle ways. Undermining people, camouflaging your sins behind the smile and the kindness, the fake. So, again, this is not our option. Some people have this weakness for violence, and some people have this weakness for insincerity and masquerading. as a nice guy when you're really not. So here's an interesting combination of divine providence and freedom of choice. Divine providence determines which kind of sin you're going to be vulnerable to and in which part of your system, thought, speech, or action, are you going to commit the sin. That makes us all unique. It also does something really strange. It kind of guarantees that there will be someone for every sin in the book. No sin left untried. Somebody is going to commit every one of the sins. And some will do it in action, and some will do it in speech, and some will do it in thought. In other words, every unholiness will be experienced, will be committed, and then the regret will nullify that unholiness or that evil. So just as every mitzvah has to be performed sooner or later by somebody, no mitzvah goes unperformed. Same is true with sins. Because every unholiness has to be redeemed. That for every sin there's somebody who is tempted. If you refuse to do it, you're refining that unholiness by denying it. Or if you commit it, then you redeem it by doing tshuva. So when we say God didn't create anything in his world that is superfluous, including sin. So sometimes we read about characters in the Torah did terrible, horrible things, and we wonder, like, why? What is wrong with these people? What pleasure did they possibly find? I would never do that. It's disgusting. That's not your test, not part of your mission. And that's why to you it's undoable, unthinkable, unspeakable. But somebody, somewhere, so right in the beginning of the Torah, God says, you may eat meat of an animal, but you may not kill yourself. Right at the beginning of the Torah. People are tempted to kill themselves. No, we're not talking about people who are severely depressed and are really out of control. God is saying, don't choose to kill yourself when you're capable of choosing. You may not kill yourself. So there's some kind of temptation for self-destruction. For most people, that's very hard to relate to. You've got a good life, no problems, no pressures, and you just want to kill yourself? Huh? Without a mental illness. Without emotional stress. Spiteful? Kind of strange. Of course, anytime somebody, God forbid, takes their own life, we assume that it was involuntary. But there must have been some time, somewhere, someplace, where somebody willingly or willfully decides to kill himself. The Torah had to tell us, not allowed. So, in a sense, when a person feels a temptation to sin, it's helpful, certainly thoughtful, to consider, why am I vulnerable to this temptation? There are so many different temptations. Why this? There's a reason. That already makes it easier for me to get a handle on it. There's a divine plan. There's a reason that I'm tempted with this sin, not some other sin. Well, if there's a plan behind all this, I become more reasonable, more objective, and I consider it more carefully, because this is not just a whim. This is a drama of life. Something cosmic is going on here. That itself helps not sin. If God would come himself and say, I am putting this temptation in front of you because this is the temptation I need you to dismiss, to overcome, to weaken. Wouldn't be too hard to dismiss it. I know why it's happening. I know what I'm supposed to do about it. Not so hard. But when we don't know that, then we get this impression, I need to, I must, it's me. How can I deny me? Okay, let's approach this whole thing from another angle. What is it that makes people behave the way they behave? Good or bad?
Law enforcement.
Yeah, there is this theory which has some merit. People behave themselves when they're being observed. If I know that somebody is watching, I'm on my best behavior. Most people. So the belief that God is watching, the eye that sees and the ear that hears, that discourages a lot of sinning. It's like there are certain people who are very righteous. They never sin, but they're hoping. Maybe one day God will turn his back and then I can sin. But as long as he's looking, I can't. I mean, to his face. Even if a child was watching, I wouldn't be able to sin. Some people can't sin in front of an animal. There are a pair of eyes on me. I can't do it. So that is a considerable deterrent in human nature. Well, let's talk about something a little different. The three things that make a person sin is or do mitzvahs, be good or bad. The first is reason. Reason. Logic, argument. The second is will. And the third is pleasure. Obviously, nobody would sin if there was no pleasure in it. You sin for the pleasure. Nobody sins if they don't want to. Nobody forces themselves to sin. And nobody sins unless they can rationalize it. But people are different from each other. Some people will manage to sin by rationalizing it, which means their thinking is off. This guy says, my wife complains that I don't spend enough time with her. I don't understand. We're married. I don't have to spend time with her. Why do I have to be nice to her? We're married already. Logical argument. He's got a logical argument for why he doesn't need to be nice to his wife. Everybody else in the room would say, that's not so logical. You know, you have different people have different opinions. To him, it's logical. When he was dating her, he had to be very nice. Once they're married, why does he have to be nice? Particularly if she is very nice to him and would never divorce him. Now, come on, now he really doesn't have to be nice. That's called logic. When I see somebody else doing the exact same thing I'm doing, it's, what kind of person? Well, who would do something? But when I do it, it's different. You know, when I do it, it's cute. It's innocent. I don't mean any harm. But that guy, sounds like a logical argument. And sometimes the argument really is logical. I have to keep my store open on Shabbos. It's when I do most of my business. Close the store on Shabbos, I might as well give it up. Logical. So the first cause of sin is your head's not on right. Your logic is justifying sin. Then there are people who, they can't play these games. I'm bad, I know, I'm a terrible husband. But I don't want to change and I'm not going to. Why? I don't want to. I don't want to force an argument, to argue that it's logical when it's not logical. He's not going to do that. And he doesn't need that. He just cannot justify denying his own will. What do you mean I can't do that? I want to. So it's my will, not my logic. I want to do this. Even God can't tell me not to do what I want. Then there's number 3. Here's a person who will not twist the logic, will not give himself cerebral justification. He also is quite accepting of the fact that you can't do whatever you want. One of my grandchildren was in the back of the car and I was driving. She was 6 or 7. And she said, I want a Slurpee. I said, fine. We'll stop in the store and we'll get a Slurpee. She says, Mommy doesn't let. I said, I am Mommy's father. And it's my job to spoil you. So we're going to go get a Slurpee. And this 7-year-old said from the back seat of the car, you know, just because you want something doesn't mean you should do it. That's a 7-year-old who not only has her head on straight, makes perfect sense to her that just because you want something. But the pleasure of a Slurpee she cannot deny. Which means if I went and bought her a Slurpee and put it in front of her, she would have a hard time refusing. Because the pleasure. Now you can't do anything about the pleasure. Because the pleasure doesn't come from you, it comes from the thing. So you can't decide that a Slurpee doesn't taste good. You can't decide that. And by the way, you tell a child, don't eat a non-kosher candy. Don't make it sound like every non-kosher candy tastes terrible. That's not honest. It's not useful. Doesn't work. Of course, a non-kosher candy tastes as good, if not better, than the kosher ones. The pleasure is there, and it's true of every sin. So a person can say, I am not going to justify my misbehavior. I don't have to do everything I feel like. But you know, if somehow I happen to get involved with that sin, I am going to enjoy it. Because I can't control that. So a person who is forced to sin, either physically coerced or threatened into doing it, they're not justifying it, they don't even want to do it. Does that mean they're not going to feel the pleasure? They can't control that. That's why you cannot choose to be a tzaddik unless that was your given destiny. Because a tzaddik finds no pleasure in a sin. It's not that he doesn't want to do it. There's no pleasure in it for him. That's a little more than human. So, to the tzaddik, if it's not godly, it tastes like chalk. Feels like chalk. There's no pleasure. But for the average human being, pleasure is beyond our control. So if somebody maliciously slips a non-kosher candy into my candy jar, and I eat it not knowing, and now I feel guilty because I really enjoyed it, that is not a cause for guilt. Because you expect not to enjoy it? That's not human. So what do? Knowing that there is pleasure in the sin, you avoid it. You don't tease yourself. You don't test yourself. You don't torture yourself. So modesty, for example, is a very smart thing. You can't deny the pleasure in physical relationships. So if you don't want to go there, don't go there. And to say, no, I can control. You can't control the pleasure. So again, the area of free choice is not so large. And that's why when we have a chance to do a mitzvah, that's an opportunity to exercise free choice. You don't have that all the time. So don't miss that opportunity. Or like kids say, You want me to do everything that it says and all the commandments and do, what am I, a robot? The only time you're not a robot, the only time you're not programmed, the only time your will, your choice is not compromised is when it comes to doing a mitzvah. That's when you stop being a robot. When you do something for your spouse that you would not do for yourself, now you're not a robot. But if you're a nice person by nature, you're nice to everybody, you're always kind, you're always helpful, you're always available to do a favor, and you treat your spouse exactly the same way, you're a robot. Programmed. When you go out of your way to do something special for your spouse, just because your spouse happens to like it, or need it, or want it, now you've stopped being a robot. Every mitzvah you do is an escape from the program. And it doesn't happen without a divine reason. You're given an opportunity to do this particular mitzvah. Some people are not. You're given the opportunity to refuse this particular sin or temptation. Some people are not. So it's tailor-made to you. That's when you can stop being a robot. That's where you have true freedom of choice. For example, how do we choose who to follow, whom to follow? We have mentors, we have teachers, we have bosses at work, we have politicians. How do you choose who you're going to have allegiance to? Whose authority are you going to accept? If you go by your nature, it's not freedom of choice. You find the teacher is my kind of guy. It's my kind of guy, so I'm going to listen to him. That's programmed. How did it happen that he's your kind of guy? You didn't choose that. But if you choose a teacher based on the morality, he demands the most from me, or she has the highest standards that I'm going to have to struggle to keep up with, that's freedom of choice. So how do we choose our leaders, our teachers, our mentors, our role models? Based on morality, not on personality. Based on values. Then it's freedom of choice. If it's just personality or type, that's not free choice. That's a choice that you have been programmed to prefer or to choose. The choice is compromised. One of the ways of identifying a reliable mentor or leader is to examine the various stages of responsibility that this person has achieved. For example, a teenager has no control or responsibility to anyone other than himself. He takes that responsibility seriously, and he is his own mentor or his own authority. He gets older and he starts a family. Now he's got responsibilities to the family. If he takes those responsibilities well, consistently, enthusiastically, that's step number 2. Now he's a member of a congregation, member of a club, member of a team. He's got new obligations, new responsibilities, because he's elected to be the captain of the team. Now, if he drops his responsibility to his family because he can only have one responsibility at a time, that shows that he's not a good leader, he's just a good worker. So whatever job he has, he does a good job. But if he were a natural leader, then he would continue to be the leader of his own life, he would continue to be the leader of his family, and now he would also be the leader of his club or community or congregation. Now he gets elected to a higher position, where he is now responsible for the whole town. If he's a real leader, it does not weaken his prior or previous obligations and commitments. It just adds to it. And so on. If he becomes a world leader, he hasn't compromised his obligation and responsibility to his family, to his congregation, to his people, to his state, to his country, but has added another layer of responsibility, but not at the expense of the others. That's a real natural leader, not just somebody who can do a job if he's given the job. Now that's, a little more than just a nice, good person trying their best. Some people are not natural leaders. Some are. So, the most powerful leader in history, the most powerful leaders of history, almost without exception, sacrificed their family. They couldn't. They couldn't have the responsibility of family and be a world leader at the same time. The really exceptional leaders didn't compromise at all.
We go back to the subject of how we make our choices. There's the pleasure you mentioned, and there's the intellect. Those are the things that tempt us or that lead us astray. Then what tools do we use to avoid temptation? If your intellect is what's pulling you away, can your intellect also be what pulls you back?
That would be quite an accomplishment. See, God did that. God brought a flood to wipe out all human beings on the face of the earth because they're bad from birth. And then after the flood, God said, "Oh, I'll never do that because they're bad from birth." Using the same argument, producing different results. The same argument justified the flood, And then after the flood, that argument argues against ever having a flood. It was very interesting. If you look at the Torah's wording and you take it seriously, God brought the flood because man is born with unholiness. Not with sin, but unholy. So he brings the flood. After the flood, Noach brings a sacrifice, and the aroma of that sacrifice was pleasing to God. And God said to his heart. Most people don't translate it literally. To his heart, they mean to himself. But the actual wording is, God said to his heart, I will never again bring a flood because human beings are unholy by birth. So look at what happened here. There's the action. Make a flood, don't make a flood. There is the emotion, the heart, that objects to the behavior. There's the logic that dictates what should be done. And then there's the pleasure from the aroma of the sacrifice. So look what happened here. God's logic said they're bad. His heart said, I'm disgusted with them. And so he brought a flood. So the mind told the heart, and the heart told the action. The mind said, this has got to stop. The heart said, yeah, I hate this. And then the flood came. But then Noach introduced the pleasure of the sacrifice, a pleasant aroma. And look what happened. The pleasure of the sacrifice turned the logic, same argument, but now instead of arguing for a flood, now it argues against a flood. What changed it? Pleasure. Which means when there's no pleasure in creation, then even intelligence argues for destruction. But where there is pleasure, suddenly the mind finds reason to continue. So pleasure really affects your thinking, positively and negatively. So if your thinking is wrong, how do you repair it? Find the pleasure. Like you have a logical argument for destruction, and you ask yourself, what's the pleasure in that? Who's going to benefit from this? Like it says in Tehillim many, many times, will the dead praise you? Those in the grave are going to sing your praises? What are you going to, if I die, what do you gain from this? Where's the pleasure in my dying? So don't kill me. So there's a hierarchy. If your emotions are out of control, the mind has the authority over the heart to bring it into line. If your head is on wrong, then the pleasure or the will has the authority to make your mind think straight or different. You can tune your thinking by introducing the pleasure or the will. You can tune your feelings by introducing the logic. And you can inspire your behavior by setting your heart on fire. So if you have an emotion, you'll do it. If the logic says, then you'll have the emotion. And if there's pleasure behind it, your logic will find a way. And that's why it's important to cultivate finer pleasures. A child is born with only one pleasure: taste and touch. So hug me and feed me, and that's all there is to life. Elevating a child, raising a child, educating a child means introduce finer pleasures. You can't go into adulthood with only the pleasure of taste and touch. That's brainless. So we elevate children by teaching them to sing, meaning the pleasure of rhythm, the pleasure of music. That's a finer pleasure than eating. So instead of putting the phone in your mouth, have it play a nice music for you. And then you want to go up from that, because even music is a sensual experience, not an emotional experience. So there's the pleasure of hearing, which is one of the senses. But the pleasure of heroism, of good behavior, of special behavior, that's much higher, a much more refined pleasure. And that's why we read stories to children, stories of people who do great things. And if you'll notice, the pleasure that you get from eating cannot compete with the pleasure you get from music. Just in sheer pleasure. And the pleasure you get from music cannot compete with how a child lights up when he hears a story about somebody special, somebody who did something heroic or exceptional. And that pleasure cannot compare to the pleasure that a child gets when he solves a puzzle, when he understands a somewhat profound idea. He gets it. He shines. That's called raising a child. If you get stuck on one of those stages, you didn't finish the project. The ultimate pleasure is altruism. Just knowing that you did the right thing. There's no deeper pleasure than that. Can't fool Mother Nature. A ride in an amusement park is not going to compete with knowing that you did the right thing. Quick story. This woman was away at college from Minnesota. And while she was away, her family became more observant. Tragically, the father passed away. And they, of course, were going to have a completely traditional funeral. Well, the daughter came for the funeral, and to her shock and surprise, her family is observing. She was very annoyed. She was very upset. What's with these rabbis running around? What are we doing? What is it? And she didn't keep it a secret. that she was uncomfortable or upset, she was quite vocal about it. During one of the days of the Shiva, she said to me, I'm really grateful or pleased that my father was buried the right way. Now, I don't know why this is the right way. In fact, I don't know what the right way is, if you would ask me. So I was a pain in the neck during the funeral. But now, it feels so good to know my father was buried the right way. So even when we don't know what makes it the right way, knowing that it was done right, there's no greater pleasure than that. Even in the presence of pain and grief, did it the right way. It's an old-fashioned idea, but it's still true. So, for all the above reasons, we should take advantage of every opportunity to do a mitzvah. Every mitzvah is freedom of choice. With every mitzvah, you step out of your robotic behavior. Every mitzvah is altruistic because we don't need it. I don't need to separate meat and milk. I don't need a mezuzah on my door. I don't need to put tefillin on every day. Why do I do it? I don't need to take off on Shabbos. It's all altruistic. But eating lunch? No, not so altruistic. Even if it's kosher. So, we have the opportunity to rise above our programmed self and actually use our freedom of choice. It's liberating.